I am the law. What has he done?
Caesar! I was there. Teacher only reverted to type under provocation. He spoke like a slave master in the old days of our servitude when we were conditioned to mechanical obedience. He uttered a negative imperative.
Could you put that into words which even Caesar could understand?
He said, "No, Aldo, no."
Hey everybody, and welcome back to Ape Nation, your number one source for all things Planet of the Apes on YouTube. My name is Josh, and today I am continuing my series of reviews for every single Planet of the Apes movie with the fifth and final entry in the original 5-movie franchise, Battle for the Planet of the Apes. If you like what I do here and want to show your support, be sure to hit the like button on this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so that you can stay up to date on all things apes. As always, before we get started, let's first take a little bit of a dive into the film's behind-the-scenes history. After the release of the fourth film in the series, Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, writer Paul Den was initially hired to provide a story treatment for the fifth film in the series. However, Den had to leave the project before the script was finished due to health reasons. Fox then brought in screenwriting duo John William Corrington and Joyce Hooper Corrington, who were just coming off the success of The Omega Man, although prior to that, neither of them had written any science fiction films, and would later admit that neither of them had ever seen any prior Planet of the Apes films. Later on during production, after Paul Den eventually recovered, he was hired to come back and do a final polish on the script, and claimed to have rewritten over 90% of the dialogue and changed the ending. The original script that was written by the Corringtons actually ended very similarly to the way the theatrical cut of the film ends, with both ape and human children fighting with each other, but Den introduced the close-up shot at the end with the statue of Caesar and a tear falling from its eye. Joyce Corrington later said that she thought the choice was stupid and that, quote, "it turned our stomachs when we saw it." Heading into filming, director J. Lee Thompson was unhappy with both the script and the scope of production, which he felt could have used a bigger budget to assist in the portrayal of the final battle in the film. Thompson had agreed to direct without a script and regretted that Paul Den could not have been on the project throughout the writing process. Harry Rhodes, who had played Mr. McDonald in Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, was originally supposed to return for the fifth film, but he was unavailable during filming, and so the character was changed to be McDonald's brother and was played by Austin Stoker. Governor Breck was also planned to return as the villain, but Don Murray wasn't interested. However, Severn Darden, who had played Culp, the security chief to Governor Breck in Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, was available to return, so he was promoted to being the main villain of the fifth film. Due to Conquest of the Planet of the Apes getting a lot of criticism when it came out for being too violent, the studio wanted the fifth film to lighten the tone and the violence in an effort to appeal more to families, and more particularly children. The film was shot primarily on the Fox Movie Ranch for a budget of $1.7 million and was released on June 13, 1973 to mixed to negative reviews, making a total of $8.3 million. As for my first experience and overall thoughts on Battle for the Planet of the Apes, when I first saw this movie, and I've reiterated multiple times when I first watched all these films, it was over the course of a weekend all in one marathon back to back, and right when I saw this movie, I immediately knew something was off. I actually liked it more than Beneath at the time, just because I really didn't like Beneath when I first saw Beneath, but I've grown to like that movie more. This one, something about it felt wrong, but I still enjoyed it. You know, I was a teenager, it had action, it was lighthearted, I liked some of the characters, I still loved Caesar, I loved Roddy McDowell, of course, but in the back of my mind, I just felt like it was missing something. It felt hollow in a way, it felt lighter. Over the next several years, as I would continue to marathon the movies and I would watch it again and again, it just kept getting worse and worse and worse, and as I became more observant of film and more knowledgeable about what my tastes are and what I think is a good film, what I think is a bad film, all that kind of stuff. Eventually, I just kind of got to a point where I realized I don't like this movie. I'll straight up say it. I think this is a bad movie. I think it has some redeeming elements, but overall, Battle for the Planet of the Apes to me, and this might be sacrilege to a lot of fans, it's the worst Planet of the Apes movie. I think it is below the Tim Burton movie. I think it is a very poorly made movie in almost every way. way. And it really hurts me to say that because I love the franchise so much, so I hate not liking one of these. Now, I'm not one of these people that gets joy out of talking badly about movies, but I am going to be open and honest about my opinion on this movie, and that is that it's not good. It has a lot of flaws and has a lot of problems, and now I'm going to talk about what those problems are. 13 years after a worldwide series of ape revolutions and a brutal nuclear war among humans, Caesar must protect survivors of both species from an insidious human cult and militant ape faction alike. Roddy McDowall returns to play Caesar, and to me, he's probably the best part of the movie. He keeps it occasionally enjoyable. It's really nice to see him as a father, even though we don't really get enough time between him and his son to really care about that relationship or care about that dynamic that much. It is still nice to see. I like that development of him as a character, and Roddy McDowall plays it in a very real and honest way, and I think he does a great job there. Caesar's arc, on the other hand, I think is just not very well done. I like the idea of his arc, and it's very fitting for this final film in the series. The entire journey of Caesar in this movie is him learning that apes are just as flawed as humans, and it's something that gets borrowed in another film that we'll talk about in just a few weeks that I think takes this concept and does it 10 times better. But in this movie, my problem with Caesar's arc is that he doesn't really get to experience it. There's nothing in the movie where he is going through a journey that he learns this lesson from, that apes aren't automatically superior to humans. He doesn't learn this throughout the movie. He gets told this at the very end of the movie, and that's how he comes to the conclusion.
The human way is violence and death.
Aldo wasn't human, was he, Caesar?
Virgil, you are a good and wise ape.
It just really bothers me. That's something that's always really annoyed me about this movie, especially when I've just watched it recently. It really stuck out. His arc just feels so tacked on, and it feels like something that they didn't really understand was even a point of the movie until they were midway through production. But like I said earlier, Roddy McDowall does still do a good job in the role, and I do enjoy Caesar as a character in the movie. I just think his arc isn't done that well, and he is one of the few things that just keeps the movie afloat and keeps it entertaining and enjoyable to some degree at some points. The next member of the cast that I want to talk about is Austin Stoker, who plays Bruce McDonald, who is the brother of Malcolm McDonald from Conquest of the Planet of the Apes. And like I said earlier, Harry Rhodes was not available for filming during this movie, so that's why they just replaced his character with his character's brother. And I have so many problems with just this on principle, just because it makes no sense. And I don't understand why they just didn't recast him or just write him out of the movie entirely. Like, by creating the brother of McDonald, not only do I no longer have that emotional connection between those two characters, because something I loved so much about Conquest of the Planet of the Apes was the relationship between McDonald and Caesar. You don't have that in this movie because McDonald's no longer there, so we don't have that history between these two characters. Just his brother is now there in his place. Why? We don't really know. It's never really explained. And as much as Austin Stoker does do a decent job in the role, I don't really care about the character because I don't have that prior connection to him from the previous film, and I don't have that connection to him and Caesar's relationship. And it really just overcomplicates what could have just been a simple recast. You know, you could have just had him play McDonald. It wouldn't have been as good because it's not Harry Rhodes giving that incredible performance, but it would have made more sense in the story, and I would have still cared a little bit more than I do currently. And so I just don't really like the decision they made to introduce his brother just because the actor couldn't come back to play the character. I just thought that was a really silly decision. If anything, they should have just written the character out of the movie entirely, but that's the way they went, and personally I think it hinders the film. And then we have another member of the cast, and this is one of the biggest issues I have with the movie. Not so much the actor. That being said, Claude Atkins plays the main villain of the film, General Aldo, and I'm just gonna be completely blunt. This is one of, if not the single worst character in the entire Planet of the Apes franchise for me. I think Aldo is a terrible character. I think he's a stupid, really poorly written, one-note villain. He's annoying, he's not menacing at all, and I just find him borderline insufferable to watch. Anytime he comes on screen, I'm just ready to be annoyed and roll my eyes. I don't find him to be intimidating. He's very mustache-twirling, boring, one-note, and just generic in every imaginable way when it comes to being a villain and just a character in general. I don't like anything about him. I really, really can't stand him as a character. character in this film. And Claude Adkins does what he can. He brings that theatricality, but that's about it. I mean, he can't really do much with this character because he's just written so poorly, and he's so generic, and he's so dull, and he's just a really stupid character. And so I wish I liked him more. I wish I didn't dislike him that much, but I really just can't stand him in the movie. He's a big problem for me, and he's a big reason why I dislike this movie as much as I do. As for someone who I do like quite a bit, I think Paul Williams as Virgil is really likable. I think he's funny. I think he's a welcome new addition to the franchise. I like his relationship with Caesar. I think he's very entertaining, and he brings that lightheartedness and that comedic relief that works well for the movie. He's one of the few bright spots, and I don't think he is like amazing or anything. I don't think he's one of my favorite characters or anything, but he's definitely one of the few bright spots in the entire movie. You also have Natalie Trundy, who returns as another character, Lisa, who she played in Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, but only got one line of dialogue when she said no at the end of that film in the theatrical cut, not the director's cut, who had also played Stevie in Escape from the Planet of the Apes, as well as one of the mutants in Beneath the Planet of the Apes. So she returns as Lisa yet again, and she does well with what she's given, but she isn't really given much. She's not that memorable in the movie. She doesn't have that big of a role, but it is somewhat of an important role in certain moments, so I do think she does okay with what she's given. There's also Bobby Porter as Cornelius, and I think he does okay for a child actor, but as for the character, I kind of just find him annoying. He's not terrible like Aldo, he's not like insufferable to watch, but there's not really that much screen time with him, especially any screen time with him and Caesar having any sort of relationship built or formed, so it's hard for me to really care that much about him as a character. It really just relies on him being Caesar's son and you caring about him because he's Caesar's son, but beyond that I just really have no attachment to him as a character. And then the one other actor slash character I did want to mention was Severn Darden as Culp. This is a character who was in Conquest of the Planet of the Apes. I think he's a much more menacing villain than Aldo. He's not really in the movie that much, and he's not that great of a villain, but I think he's better than Aldo, and I think he, for the most part, does a good job in the role. But that's all I really have to say about the cast and the characters in this film. Like I said, there's a lot of problems I have with some of the characters, but there are some characters I like Caesar, like Virgil. You know, there are some standouts, there are some decent performances in there. As for the story that's being told in this movie, this is where another handful of my problems stem from. Something I talked about in my Conquest of the Planet of the Apes review was the time jump from Escape to Conquest and how it didn't really make much sense how things could have escalated that much in such a short amount of time. And part of my reasoning for that is less to do with the amount of time, because obviously things can change in such a short amount of time. It was more to do with the fact that there was no real explanation for how everything went down. It was really just left up to all the cats and dogs died, and then 8 years later, we live in the world of Conquest of the Planet of the Apes. Doesn't really make a lot of sense, but I didn't mind it as much because I loved the rest of the movie so much, and because I thought Caesar's journey and Caesar's character and Roddy McDowall's performance were so good that none of that stuff could take too much away from what I liked about the movie. With this movie, it just makes absolutely no sense. This movie takes place 13 years after Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, which is kind of up for debate if that's actually the case, but according to the official timeline that was released with the 2008 Blu-ray collection of the entire franchise, this movie takes place 13 years after Conquest of the Planet of the Apes. So that is the date that I've always adhered to as being the official canon of when this movie takes place. That being said, there are lines in the movie that make you wonder if it actually takes place 12 years later, or if it's 10 years later, or if it's 30 years later. It's not really clear in the movie.
This armory's been my home for 27 years.
You may live in it for the rest of your days.
It's made even more confusing by the way that the movie looks, and I'm going to get into all that in just a little bit, but it just is so confusing when this movie actually takes place because it's kind of just kept really vague, and it makes no sense why they would keep it kind of vague. As for just the story overall and what's being told, it feels very generic and very impersonal compared to the previous two films that were so heavily character driven. In this movie, I mean, on top of the fact that there really just isn't that much of a real story going on beyond the humans are out there and the apes are having problems. There's not much of a real conflict going on. It ultimately is just a bunch of plot beats that are put in place so that we can have some fight scenes towards the second half of the movie, and it's really boring, and I don't really enjoy it at all. I don't get any sort of emotional stimulation or mental stimulation out of it whatsoever, and it just really lets me down, especially compared to the previous two films films where they were heading, it really just feels like such an underwhelming letdown. I do think that the movie has some good ideas. I think the whole guerrilla uprising and the ape versus human conflict, there is potential there. I think they could have done something interesting. They could have tapped into something really unique, but ultimately they're all half-baked and it rushes through most of them and they just have no real impact by the time the movie is over. I do think the movie's at its best, and there's not a lot of scenes with this in the movie, but I think it's at its best when it's focused on Caesar, Virgil, and MacDonald. I think the three of them are at the very least an entertaining trio. They have a decent camaraderie, they're fun to watch, and that sequence where the three of them go to explore the Forbidden City looking for the archived recordings of Cornelius and Zira, I think all that stuff, to me, it's one of the better parts of the movie.
There it is, or was, like a storm at sea, but solidified.
By a bomb from an armory 1,000 times the size of ours.
And nobody to keep its owner's conscience.
And so again, anytime those three are together, it is pretty entertaining, and I do enjoy those three together as characters. Jumping back into what I was talking about with the 12-year time jump and how it becomes so convoluted and it doesn't make sense. When I say it doesn't make sense, it really just doesn't make sense for the state of the world that's established in this movie. We're led to believe that nuclear war broke out following conquest of the Planet of the Apes, and that it sent civilization so far back that all human technology, even things like paper and pencils, are gone. It's just so insane that things have gone this far back to like this primitive Stone Age, and it makes no sense. There's no explanation as to why, and it also makes no sense because all the humans are kind of just like, okay, this is just how we live now. There's also the fact that the apes have gained the ability to not just speak, but speak fluent English and read and write, and their intelligence is so evolved to the point where they are as smart as the apes were in the original Planet of the Apes. And it just makes no sense whatsoever how everything could have gone this far, this fast, with no explanation whatsoever. It doesn't work. It makes it so hard to buy into anything that's going on in the movie. Obviously, it's science fiction. Obviously, it's make-believe, but it still has to work within the rules of its own world, and it just doesn't. It makes no real sense as to how it evolved. The evolution of apes just happens. The world has now basically been reset to the Stone Age. Humans and apes are just living side by side as if nothing happened, and the world that is established doesn't make any sense for the time in which it takes place. And so that's always been a huge issue for me with this movie, and it's something that I just can't get past. I think maybe I wouldn't mind as much if some of the other stuff was more compelling, if the rest of the story was actually a little more personal when it comes to Caesar, and if maybe Aldo was a better villain, maybe I wouldn't mind. But even then, it's just so far-fetched, and it just is so forced when it comes to furthering the story that it really sinks the movie down for me. And then on top of all of that, the filmmaking as a whole just doesn't work, and it's shocking to me that this is from the same director of Conquest of the Planet of the Apes. Now, it does make sense that he was unhappy with the script, and he was very unhappy with a lot of the way that the film was made when he was working on it, but still, it's so crazy to me how J. Lee Thompson is the one who made this movie right after Conquest of the Planet of the Apes was such a good film and such a great success when it comes to the Apes franchise. First thing I really dislike about it is the way it looks. It has this very amateurish, made-for-TV, low-budget look, and obviously the last few sequels have had lower budgets, but to me it isn't until this movie that you can really start to see it. The film also just feels really emotionally hollow, and it's too light for the story that it's trying to tell. I understand that the studio wanted to lighten the tone, they wanted to bring down the violence, make it a little more kid-friendly, but I think it came at the cost of making an effective movie that had a tone that was fitting for the story that they wanted to tell. It feels completely off. It feels like they were trying to make this big epic finale, or at least that's what they were initially aiming for, but when it came to actually filming the movie and putting it together, they had to compromise and make something that they can make sure 6-year-olds could watch and not be traumatized, which I understand that from a business perspective, but from a filmmaker perspective and from an artist perspective and from a fan perspective, it just suffers and it really sinks the movie. I think the battle scenes are entertaining. I don't think they're amazing, but I don't think they're terrible. I think they're entertaining to watch, but they have their moments. It doesn't compare to the riot sequences from Conquest or even some of the action scenes from the first first two films, but they are fun, they are entertaining to watch, and they serve their purpose well enough. I also think that the ape has killed ape scene towards the end of the movie is really, really effective, and it's one of the few really emotionally impactful scenes. I think it's one of the few moments in the movie where it really feels like the same filmmaker of Conquest came back to do this movie. It's one of the only times in the movie where it feels anywhere similar to the tone of that movie or of the same level of quality filmmaking, in my opinion. I also really like the ending, and I really like the way it's bookended with the lawgiver. It's a really refreshing approach, and it works well for the story that they're telling, and it works well for a finale to this series. And when it comes to the ending in particular, what I really love the most about it is it continues the trend of the previous 4 Apes films, even in its finale. It doesn't end with a big happy celebration. It ends in this kind of middle ground, you know? It's not a completely hopeless ending like the first 4 movies are, but it's also not a happy ending. It finds this middle ground in between where it's kind of left up to your own interpretation as the viewer. While the original writers may have thought the statue of Caesar crying is stupid, I couldn't disagree more, and I'm really glad that Paul Den added it into the script, because to me, it's a perfect ending to this series. Depending on who you ask, the tear could be symbolizing that Caesar is crying tears of joy because apes and humans have finally found peace together, or he could be crying because he knows deep down that humans and apes will never truly live in peace and they will always be at war with each other. And I think that's a perfect way to end this series of movies. In a way, it kind of thematically represents what the overall franchise is about in general. I just think that the overall filmmaking is a huge step down from Conquest, so that just makes it very disappointing for me, but there are still elements to enjoy. Just like with Conquest, there is an extended cut of this film. However, unlike with Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, the extended cut of this film, it's not the unrated cut, it's just the extended cut, and that's because it doesn't really do much as far as changing the tone or changing the level of violence or anything like that, and it really just doesn't do that much to improve the film. It's really just a bunch of slightly longer versions of certain scenes, and it adds one little connection to Beneath the Planet of the Apes with the Alpha Omega bomb reference. But aside from that, it doesn't really do much. I don't personally think it's worth seeking out if you haven't seen it. I mean, if you're an Apes fan and you really want to watch every version of every Apes movie, go for it. You can find it on the Blu-ray. But for me, the extended cut doesn't really add much. It's more or less the same movie, just with a couple of extra bits added on. One thing I will say about this movie that I like, and is the one and only improvement over Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, is the makeup and prosthetic work. Something I really like about this movie, which when I rewatched it, I was actually really surprised that this was the case. As far as I can tell, there is no masks used in this entire film. It doesn't rely on the pullover masks. It's all makeup, and it all looks really great. It still holds up and it looks really great. So in that one aspect, it does step things up from Conquest because it doesn't rely on the pullover masks, and there is a lot more use of makeup when it comes to not just main character apes, but background apes as well. So I do really appreciate that. As for the music, Leonard Rosenman, who returns from Beneath the Planet of the Apes, is the one who did the musical score for this movie, and if I'm being honest, I think it's probably the weakest score of the entire series. It sounds cheaply recorded, and it also sounds like a half-baked attempt at recapturing Jerry Goldsmith's original music, and to me, it actually sinks some of the movie down. It goes hand in hand with that tonal mismatch, and I don't like what they do with the overall music. Like I said, the ape has killed ape scene, I think the music in that moment works really well, and it adds to that eeriness, and it adds to that intensity and effectiveness, but for the rest of the movie, the score just feels like a made-for-TV adventure film, and I have never been a fan of it. As with the rest of the movie, I wish I did, so it was at least something I could really enjoy, but unfortunately, the music is just another element that sinks the movie down for me. And then as for the types of themes that this movie is talking about, similar to the other Planet of the Apes films, something I do like is that just like with Conquest, it is delving into something a little bit different, and it is finding something new to talk about and a new way to talk about it. I do appreciate that the movie is trying to have a conversation about race relations, specifically in the United States. This was something that was incredibly relevant to what was going on in the world at the time of this movie's release, arguably very relevant to conversations that are still being had today and situations that are still going on in the world. And I do appreciate that the movie is taking that when talking about the way that humans and apes live together and the hierarchy and how that is supposed to work and who's in charge and how it's supposed to all work. And I really like the way that the movie handles that. And slightly to a lesser degree, I really appreciate that the movie talks about killing and the morality of killing in the name of justice. I think that's an interesting subject that has not really at all been touched upon in the Planet of the Apes series. The ape does not kill ape idea has been around since the beginning of the franchise, but it's never been really delved into on much of a deeper level. And I think that this is the first movie that does that, and I really appreciate that they do that. I wish it had been delved into a little more, but I do like that they handle it. I do like that they go into it, and I think it raises some interesting questions.
Oh, if only my mother and father, whom I was too young to remember, if only they'd lived, perhaps they would have taught me if it was right to kill evil so that good should prevail.
But you know, Caesar, history shows...
Well, that is human history, not ape history. Ape never kills ape.
So overall, I find Battle for the Planet of the Apes to be a massive disappointment following the previous films, and to me it ends the series on a giant whimper. There are some elements that I enjoy, but the story and general filmmaking are both really subpar in multiple aspects, and as much as I do enjoy some things here and there, it's just not enough to save the movie. If you like this movie, I am very happy for you. I know there are some people in the comments that have even said this is one of their favorites, so I'm sorry, but it's just my opinion, and I want to know what your opinion is on Battle for the Planet of the Apes. What did you think of my review? Do you agree with me that this is the worst Planet of the Apes movie, or do you think there are certain things that make it better than I am saying it is? Do you disagree with any of my points? Do you agree with my points? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Now that we have finally made it to the end of the original Planet of the Apes series, my next review will be for Tim Burton's 2001 remake of Planet of the Apes. That review will be out very soon, but until then, thank you so much for checking out today's video here on Ape Nation. If you liked this video, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so that you can stay up to date on all things apes. I'll catch you in the next one, so until then, goodbye.